I wish to return to the matter of industrial relations difficulties in local government, in particular that faced by firefighters across the country, retained firefighters that is, and Irish Water, water workers who are not intending to transfer to Irish Water. I raised this matter with the Taoiseach, your party leader, last week, and he urged that water workers engage with the industrial relations machinery of the state. However, the difficulty is that they already have engaged with that industrial relations machinery, and a framework came out, and you welcomed the framework, and it was all great. You even wrote a letter to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions saying that that framework would be honoured in spirit and in letter. However, it seems that it won't be when it comes to Irish water workers who wish to remain in the local authorities, because they're not being guaranteed their allowances and they can't get a guarantee around that, and they've been in protracted negotiations now with the LGMA, and while yes, they're free to stay, and yes, there has been progress, as you've correctly pointed out, on some of the issues, there is no progress on allowances, in particular their weekend allowances, because they work over 7 days. Most, not all, but most local authority employees work over 5 days, they work over 7. That allowance is a significant part of their income on a weekly basis, and it is also pensionable, so it will have very large ramifications for workers, and many of them are approaching, not all, but many of them are approaching pensionable age, and I would dare say many of those who will remain in local authorities. Now, with a little bit of ingenuity, there are many roles in local authorities other than water workers that do require 7-day cover, caretakers, for example, but there are many others. So, I mean, if there was any will from the LGMA and from the local authority senior management to accommodate them, they could easily be accommodated. Similarly, with firefighters, they voted for industrial action last January, and they've been negotiating with the LGMA. There's a huge retention crisis in Clare. In almost all of the bases in Clare, there's one in Ennisdiamond, there's one in Kilrush, there's one in Shannon, there's one in Killaloe, there's one in Scariff. They all perform a hugely valuable role. They're first responders, not just to fires, but to traffic accidents, to a variety of in Ennis, there's also a retained fire service, of course. Not all of the staff in Ennis are retained, the vast majority are. In Shannon, for example, they provide a backup. That might be anathema or a surprise to you in North County Dublin, but in Shannon they provide a very valuable, retained firefighters provide a very valuable backup to Shannon Airport services. And they're understaffed. And they're understaffed right across, to the extent that it's dangerous and they're putting their lives at risk. I want to know what you, as the line minister responsible, are going to do to avert these impending strikes.
That's true.
Yeah, just to bring you back, Deputy, firstly it's important to say, look, the men and women in the retained fire service I respect greatly, and I've met many of them all across the country. And that's why I actually commissioned the report into the retained fire services in Ireland, with an emphasis on issues that you've mentioned, okay, recruitment and retention. And as I said to Deputy Smith earlier on, we'd over 1,000 submissions to that, many of them from firefighters themselves. In December, I accepted the recommendation of the Management Board of the National Directorate in Fire Services to publish the completed review. I brought it to Cabinet. Government accepted the findings of the report, so I want to be very clear on that too, noting the 13 recommendations contained to address those issues around recruitment and retention in retained fire services, and really importantly to ensure its sustainability into the future, particularly around recruitment. Discussions between staff and employer representatives on the 13 recommendations began, and we did establish the Fire Services National Oversight Implementation Group that you've referred to, and that was chaired by Mr. David Begg in January 2023. The LGMA were involved. It was supported by the Chief Fire Officers Association and indeed officials from my own department. And following a proposal by staff side representative, discussions on the priority industrial relations issues of remuneration and work-life balance were moved to third-party facilitation forum, and that was agreed again by all. Ulton Courtney was subsequently engaged by the LGMA at the behest of SIPTU to chair those discussions, and broadly they went very well. The agreed key deliverable required that the process is a revised composite agreement that will be agreed by all stakeholders and that will standardise future employment terms and conditions across all authorities, including pay and allowances. And during those discussions, real progress was made on the provision of a revised model of retained fire services delivery that would provide for effective service delivery and a suitable work-life balance, as I mentioned earlier on, including structured time off, which is a major issue for people who work in the retained fire services. However, at this stage, it's not been possible to reach a positive conclusion to that process to the satisfaction of all of the parties. I've outlined to Deputy Smith, just given a flavour for the things that were offered. SIPTU notified all local authorities of their intention of the retained fire services to begin a period of industrial action from the 6th of June, with weekly escalations following that. Now, it won't affect emergency service provision, but there's a small number of issues that are outstanding, mainly relating to a pay element that can be resolved. But we've also got the public sector pay talks. You'll be coming back in a second in relation to building momentum. Okay, so we can't do it necessarily outside of that. We've made real progress on the rostering, real progressing on time off, real progress on allowances also. And I believe, and I want this resolved. I've retained the fire services directly under myself. I haven't delegated that function because I have immense regard for it, and I think we can resolve it, and there is a desire to do so.
Minister, if you're saying that the retainer paid to retain firefighters is going to be linked to the pay of other public service employees as part of a public service agreement, guaranteeing them a real proper wage, I think that's something they'd welcome, but I don't think that's what you're saying. But I would very much like to see that happening because of the service that they provide. And of course, many of them are already on social welfare, so it's already costing the state because they can't, because of the onerous requirements around being a retained fire officer. It's very hard to get employment. I mean, you have to have an employer who's willing to facilitate you. It has to be within a certain distance from the station, which are difficult conditions. But going back to the other successful negotiations that you pointed to, how well they were going, but for the fact that there's going to be a strike next week. Does the LGMA enjoy some kind of a veto over your department? Because the government sign off on something and they agree with something, and then they're passed it back to negotiations, the LGMA veto it. So will this allowance, this weekend allowance, you wrote in a letter to the Congress that it would be honoured in spirit, like their pay would be honoured in spirit and in letter. Will they get their weekend allowance, or are the LGMA going to be allowed to veto it, as the LGMA are allowed to veto progress with regard to the retained fire officers?
Look, no party has a veto. Firstly, I'm not going to negotiate here in the Dáil. I have outlined very significant progress that we've made, and there's a desire amongst all parties to get this resolved. It's been a difficult process right the way through. Obviously, first thing I did when I was appointed minister was remove any reference to the fact that there would be any compulsory transfer. And there will be no compulsory transfers. Anyone who wants to stay in local government will stay in local government, and their pay and conditions will be protected. And I said that in writing myself. That's absolute fact. There are issues around overtime and allowances, which I believe are eminently resolvable. We've already said with regard to allowances that if someone who stays in the local government sector, that the equivalent overtime would be offered in that space, okay? So I've written to the unions today, and I've asked them to re-engage under the Irish Water Consultative Group. I don't believe there's a need for industrial action. I don't believe there's a need for the public in any way to be discommoded here over a very small number of issues.
Thank you, Minister.
And I'm asking people and unions to re-engage with a process that has worked very well heretofore, and we're close to its finalisation. Sometimes things can get tricky toward the end. That can happen just before an agreement, but I believe that an agreement can be made, and I'm open for that to happen.
But it's 25% of their pay. It's not a small issue.
That concludes leaders' questions.